I wanted to talk a little bit today about artificial intelligence, or AI, how it's becoming ubiquitous in our lives, and the challenges that we need to address as a community. About a week ago, Shaykh Yasir did a khatir on AI and its impact on Muslims, and so this is kind of a follow-up talk, a little bit more detail on the stuff that he touched on. My goal is to touch on a lot of topics and spark some interesting directions of thought. We don't really have the time to get into the meat of any of them, but I want to get us thinking about them, and hopefully inspire some of us here to develop expertise and contribute to the field itself, inshallah. So I'm going to rush through some things, some basic things, so we can focus on some of the more interesting things. But generally speaking, and this is the definition that I sort of just made up on my own, it may not be fully complete, but it'll give you the idea. AI is a set of computer systems that are capable of performing cognitive tasks. I'll explain what these are. Performing cognitive tasks that we normally associate with human beings. Things like perception, like hearing and seeing. Things like reasoning. Things like understanding, comprehension, planning, problem solving. And then learning. So by learning specifically, what I mean is improving in the performance of some sort of task based on feedback. So if there's computer systems that are capable of performing these cognitive tasks, we generally club them under the umbrella of artificial intelligence systems. Now, AI is already pervasive in our lives, whether you know it or not. The way that pricing is determined for the things that we buy. The way that search engines figure out what you're actually looking for. You can give your search engine a pretty vague phrase. Generally speaking, most of the time it kind of knows exactly what you're looking for. The way that we talk to customer service. The way that even prison sentences are recommended. The way that a company decides if they want to interview you. The way that a company decides if they should give you a free trial because they think that you'll become a paid customer. The way that fraudulent transactions on your credit cards are flagged. Your Amazon recommendations. Your Uber driver match. Your life is very likely touched by dozens and dozens of AI models every day. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about another revolution happening on the research side. And it kind of burst onto the scene early last year when ChatGPT got huge. And we moved into a new phase of AI in terms of the public consciousness, generative AI, where you generate content, you generate media, you generate text and audio and video and pictures. We've seen some really impressive examples. I'll go through some of them. We're able to generate stories, summarize documents, and even write and debug computer code. People have used it to write entire khutbahs. And we'll get into why that might be a little bit problematic later. ChatGPT was able to pass the final exam of an MBA course at a pretty prestigious university. I believe it was an Ivy even. It's able to proofread your resume. It's able to write your essay for you. It can generate recipes for you. And so AI has been around. It's been helping us improve the quality of our lives for at least a couple of decades, or perhaps longer. But generative AI, and that's what I'm getting at, generative AI is a step function change. And by that, what I mean is that it's a kind of disruptor. It's shaking the way that we do things. It enables a vast medley of things that we didn't think we could do with AI before. In the 2000s, before neural networks became really big in around 2012 and after, before deep neural networks became really big around then, we had decent models. We could do classification, we could do prediction, we could do some bioinformatics. We could do them pretty well. But this is a change, and it enables a number of applications that, some examples of which I will go through, inshallah. So here's a few examples of what ChatGPT can do. We've all seen some really cool examples. This is just to refresh our memories. So I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and we're talking about how this idea that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids something, He forbids it because it's actually bad for us. He doesn't forbid it just because. And when it comes to riba, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade it because it is actually bad for us as individuals, as societies, as communities. Right? It leads to harms in the way that money circulates in the economy. And so I asked ChatGPT to write a short essay on the harms of an interest-based economy. And within a few seconds, it had generated something that is pretty decent. So if you have a few moments, you can glance over what it generated. It talked about detrimental effects on individuals, communities, and the environment. It talks about prioritizing short-term gains over sustainability. It talks about wealth inequality and social tensions, eroding trust in institutions, hindering social mobility, and ultimately weakening the fabric of society. So it may be that some of these reasons are behind the illah of why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have forbidden riba for us. I was talking with a friend the other day. I was giving him a ride back from where I was to Seattle, and he wanted to go on a hike over the weekend. So he was asking me, he had just moved there, and he asked me, what should I do when I go to the Olympic Peninsula? It's a beautiful part of Washington State. And so I spent the half-hour ride trying to draw on my memories. I'd been there a few times, so I told him, first you stop at Hurricane Ridge, and then you go to Lake Crescent, and then there's Merrimack Falls, and then you can go to the coast, and you can do this. It took me like 15, 20 minutes to come up with a nice itinerary for him. So I planned it all out for him, like a whole weekend itinerary. And then when I came back home, I thought, well, let me ask ChatGPT what it would have done. And as you can see, it came up with a pretty good itinerary. And as someone who lives in Washington State, as someone who's been to the peninsula, I can tell you this is a pretty good itinerary. It almost matched what I told him, actually. It's missing a few spots, but it does pretty well. And so you can see how ChatGPT is useful to help your productivity. Now, I was coming to Dallas, so I asked it to do the same thing for Dallas. And it's weird. I've never seen it do this before. It told me, Dallas? 2 days? Seriously, man? That's beyond my capabilities. I'm good, but not that good. Okay, what else can it do? It can write code for you. So I asked it, can you write me a script to find and delete the largest files on my computer? And it came up with a few lines of bash code to do that. It looks fine. It looks like it does the job. If any of you knows bash scripting, you can go through this. By the way, just because you can get it to generate code to do something doesn't mean it's a good idea to actually run it. Right? I have a friend in Seattle who has zero coding experience. And he came up to me and he said, I want to extract this really particular piece of data from this website. And it was a little hard because the website uses some weird rendering and stuff like that. And so he was able to get ChatGPT to write Python code to extract the data that he needed. It took some back and forth. It took a little bit of help, but he was able to do it. And this person has no coding experience. So it's able to improve productivity in certain ways. At the end of this talk, you'll have a high-level idea of how it is that we can generate something like this. Another really hot and new area in generative AI is text-to-image synthesis. So you provide the machine with a text prompt. In this case, I was in Chicago when I generated this. I asked the machine to come up with a little bit of Seattle in Chicago. So you could see the Sears Tower in the background, and for some reason it decided that waterfalls are an essential feature of Seattle, and so it put a waterfall in the middle of downtown Chicago. So it's able to generate this image. Obviously, this is not true, right? This is not reality. It's able to generate this fairly realistic-looking image in a matter of a few seconds. And so this is an example of an image where the places don't quite match up. This next example is, I told it to generate an example of a fighter plane at the time of the fall of Constantinople in the 1400s. So there's the city of Constantinople, it's falling to the Muslims, and I asked it to generate a picture of a fighter plane at that time. So it's a very anachronistic image, right? You can do this, by the way. You can generate pictures like this on your laptop now. And I'm being a little bit ridiculous with these examples because I want you to imagine what people can do with this. Imagine people generating pictures and passing them around on their groups, right? Imagine somebody generating a picture of the Pope at the Kaaba in Sajjad, for example. Can you imagine that picture bouncing on the WhatsApp groups? Generating excitement? Can you imagine a picture or an image or a video of Shaykh Yasser using an Android phone? He'd be so embarrassed, right? So I'm being ridiculous again, like I said, because I want your mind to imagine where this can go. You can even do videos now, right? And it's not all bad. I don't mean this to scare you or to drill fear into your hearts. It opens up a lot of possibilities as well. Imagine your own Shaykh Bajur teaching a class and then having it immediately translated into 20 languages as he's speaking. Into Bahasa Indonesia, into Swahili, into Russian, into Turkish, into Urdu and Farsi as he's speaking. This is the kind of thing that generative AI is capable of. And the video would appear as if he was speaking those languages natively. It wouldn't be like a dub, right? Another application is text and poetry. These large language models are trained on practically everything that's available online, including ancient texts. They're good at generating stories and texts, including poetry. So one of my friends, he was in a bit of a playful mood. He asked it to generate some classical Arabic poetry in the style of Imr al-Qais, who is a pre-Islamic poet, a well-known pre-Islamic poet. And so one of his poems, one of his most well-known poems, is about a lost love. And so the prompt that my friend gave to ChatGPT was to rewrite the opening lines of his poem in Arabic, but instead of being heartbroken over a lost love, pretend that you're heartbroken over a lost bowl of mansaf. Okay, again, being ridiculous here, right? And then he instructed it, of course, to not be super serious, to not begin in the name of Allah. And so it came up with this poem, and it translated it for him as well. So you can see that it's able to do a decent job. It's not great, obviously, but if you have a minute, you can read the translation of the poem that it generated. Again, in the style of this pre-Islamic poet, Imr al-Qais. Another area where generative AI will cause a revolution, or is on the way to causing a revolution, is in the area of generating proteins. One of the most incredible things we're able to do with generative AI is to actually make proteins. The hype hasn't really quite caught on yet, but I think that this is one of the underrated directions that has the potential to change our lives. In September 2022, Nature magazine published a research paper from the Institute for Protein Design at the University of Washington, not far from where I live. And what that paper was talking about was that they were able to generate proteins with a specific shape that they wanted in silico, in a lab. Now, this is not a lecture of biology. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a biologist. I'm not an expert in these things. And so I'm not going to go into detail about this. But what I will say is that proteins mediate every single life process, right? And the shape of those proteins is what allows them to be effective. And we cannot predict the shape of a protein just based on its sequence. We have to actually develop it, make it, and then see how it folds. And the way that it folds is determined by which of its parts are hydrophobic and hydrophilic, and a bunch of other things. And so you can't really predict its shape. You can't work it out on paper. But you can use generative AI to say that I want to generate a protein of this shape, because maybe a protein of that shape is going to act as an antigen, or cause your body to create antigens to combat COVID or some other disease. Before, the way that you developed drugs was you got some blood from somebody who was infected with that disease, you figured out what the antigens look like, you figured out how to generate those antigens, and then you made drugs, you tested them, you had trials, and then you made your drug, and then, or vaccine or something, right? And then you manufactured it. But here, generative AI is able to say that, you're able to tell generative AI, this is the exact shape that I want. I want you to go and generate the amino acid sequence that will then fold into this particular shape. Now, if you look at all the possible proteins that you can generate, only 1% or less of them actually occur naturally in nature. Another 99% or more of the shapes of proteins don't occur naturally. So this opens up a lot of doors for us to do things that we haven't been able to do before because we haven't been able to generate those proteins. So you can directly create antigens to diseases, for example. You can, this can potentially lead to gene editing technology that could automatically produce proteins to rectify DNA errors. Right? If we have elements of our DNA that lead to cancer, for example, perhaps you can develop gene therapy. Right? What if you wanted kids to have a longer nose, for example, or you want your kids to have dimples? Maybe we can do this. And the reason I bring up this example is because now this opens up a question of fiqh for us. What is permissible and what isn't? You could develop personalized therapeutics using this type of tech. You could develop designer drugs. There's a lot more you can do, right? Imagine telling an AI assistant to write an email for you. You see a couch on Facebook Marketplace you want to buy. Imagine telling your AI assistant to write email and send it to the seller. Or to call your barbershop and schedule an appointment for next week for a haircut. Right? These are the kinds of things that generative AI is capable of already today. It can generate its own code. Today, to develop a software application, you might need a team of 10 people and a few managers and a few product people and some testers, right? And you might take a year to do it. And whatever software you generate will likely be buggy, and it can only do that one thing. You want to write software for a dentist's office? You spend a year of time, you hire 10 people, you pay their salaries, and at the end, you have software that can do that only do that one thing. Now imagine the applications where your computer can generate its own code, where it can think through its own algorithms to accomplish something. It opens up a lot of doors. I have a friend in Seattle, he runs an education tech company, and he publishes a lot of educational materials. And so I was talking with him a while ago, actually, right after ChatGPT had come out, and he said that the year 2023, he was going to focus on translating what his company had already produced into 5 or 6 different languages, so they could expand their market share. They could expand the impact of their work product. And so he had almost lined up people who spoke those 6 languages fluently, and he had lined up a QA team. He had lined up all he had needed. He just had to sort of pull the trigger on hiring them and getting that process going. And then ChatGPT came out, and he could translate his materials into as many languages as he wanted at the click of a button. So all the work that he had planned for 2023, he didn't need to do that anymore, because ChatGPT could do it for him right away. So this kind of technology opens up a lot of doors. For him, it changed the way that he does business. I want to spend a little bit of time going into how they work, just because I want you to have a sense of where they're useful and where they're not useful, okay? And we'll come back to that. So this is just a little bit technical. You can zone out here if you want for a little bit. If you're not interested, I'll tell you when to snap back to attention, inshallah. Now, obviously, computers don't have an innate understanding of language the way that we do, right? All they understand are zeros and ones. And so when we think of a word, we kind of picture what it is, we have a sense of what it means, how it relates to other words, how it relates to real-life concepts. Computers obviously don't have any of that. And so we need to find a way of representing language as zeros and ones. And so one of the early ways that so this is called language modeling, right? So one of the early ways in which we modeled language was by using these things called n-grams. And so we measured the frequency of how many times we saw words occur with one another. So if we look at pairs of words, let's look at the entire internet, right? However many, the estimate is that there's about 10 to the 13 tokens on the internet that you could train with for large language models. But there's millions and billions of documents. And so look at all the sentences in those documents. And then look at every single pair of words. So if there's a sentence that goes, Dallas is known for hot summers, for example, right? So what you do is you break the sentence down into pairs of words. The pair Dallas is, and then the pair is known, and then the pair known for, and then for hot, and so on. And you do this for every single document and every single pair of words that you see occurring next to one another. And you count. You count. And that's how you get a sense of what words are likely to occur with one another. And when you do that counting, you kind of get a sense of how likely is it that the next word is something else. right? So if you were to write a sentence saying Dallas is, okay, and you can fill in the blank now. Now, because you've seen the entire internet, because you've seen every single document that was digitized and published on the internet, you now have a probability for every single word that could come after this, right? So it could be Dallas is, could be hot, could be vast, could be known for good food, could be known for epic, right? So many things. And now you have a probability for each of these things. So this is a very basic language model. This is not exactly how LLMs work, but it's useful to think about this way. So this is one concept that I wanted to introduce, just to get a sense. I'll bring it back to this. The other thing is, the way that these large language models work is that they're very, very deep neural networks. And what that is that neural networks are these architectures that are modeled on the brain. So they're modeled on our neurons and axons and how our brain cells communicate. And so, again, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the way that they work is that they take in some input. And so on the screen, you'll see variables 1 through 4. They take in some input. Each of these nodes, these circles that you see, is connected to the next layer of nodes through a branch or a line. And each of those has weights. And so what happens is that you represent your input as a series of numbers. Your input could be measurements that your input could be a word. Your input could be things like, suppose your bank wants to figure out a credit transaction is fraudulent or if it's valid, right? You live in Plano, Texas, and somehow somebody got your credit card and they're using it at a gas station in New Jersey. And so what your bank does is it figures things out. What's the amount of the transaction? What's the zip code this is happening in? What kind of merchant is it? Has this person ever been to New Jersey before? What time of day is it? Right? It'll figure out all of these things, and then it'll pass them through the neural network. So it'll multiply those values by these weights that are associated with each of these branches. Those values then propagate into the next layer of nodes. You apply some sort of function to them, and then they keep moving to the next layer. Again, you multiply them by the weights, you add them up, you apply a function, and then you keep doing this through all the layers of your network until you get to the end, until you get a classification. So you might get a classification saying, yes, this is a fraudulent transaction. Right? I think that there's a 99% chance that this is a fraudulent transaction and that it should not be approved. Okay? Or you might have, as your variables, a picture. And at the end, you might have a classification saying, it's a picture of a cat, or this is a picture of mountains. Or you might have, maybe an MRI scan. And you might have a decision at the end saying whether it's anomalous or not. So at a very, very high level, this is how neural networks work. And if you remember matrices from high school, all of what I just said, right, the input values, the multiplication by the weights on those connections, and then adding them up, and then applying a function, you can represent all of that as a series of matrix multiplications. So it's very, very basic math. Now, how does a network know what to predict at the end? How does it know that if I see this input, then the output should be that this is a fraudulent transaction, or this is not a fraudulent transaction? And so the key to that is that you want to make sure that those weights in the network reflect what it is that you want it to do. So the process of doing that is called training a neural network. And the way you do that is that you teach it. You say that if you see this, then this should be the classification. So you feed your example through the network, you look at the output. If it's correct, you do nothing. If it's incorrect, you go and tweak the weights. You tweak the weight a little bit to make it correct, right? I'm simplifying a lot here, but that's generally how it works. So this is how you do it. And so I see you all have your notebooks and pencils. Fantastic. But this is a math light talk. I'm not going to go into the math. But it's very basic math. It's high school math, right? It's a chain rule. It's derivatives. It's addition, multiplication, matrices. Very basic math. The key, though, is that you do it trillions of times. You do it trillions of times. Because you have these huge neural networks. Okay, so that's the second part. Now, you might have heard the term deep neural networks, and that really just means that there's a lot of layers in between. So you have your input layer, you have your output layer, and then if you have a lot of layers in between, then it's called a deep neural network. And so that just means a lot of matrix multiplications, right? I'll have a slide about scale later to explain how many calculations are we talking about. The other piece is that there's a very specific architecture of these neural networks that change the way that we process language. They're called transformers. This was a paper out of Google in late 2017, I believe. It's called Attention is All You Need. And so a lot of the large language models you see today, ChatGPT and Llama and Mistral and all the other large language models, they're essentially based on this very specific architecture called transformers. And the final piece I want to talk about is representing words as numbers, because these neural networks, they understand numbers, they don't understand words. And so the way that you transform a word into numbers is called an embedding or a vector. You'll see this term a lot if you read about LLMs, word vectors, word embeddings. And it's really just a fancy way of saying that it's a numerical representation of a word. So you take a word and you represent its meaning by a set of numbers. So that is the embedding. So if we were to represent the words, for example, say cat, kitten, dog, and houses, and we were to project them down into 2 dimensions, the way that we would want these representations or these embeddings to work is that we want the words for cat and kitten to be close, for some definition of close, in the space that we project them in, or in the space that we represent them in. Because cat and kitten are kind of related. They're more related than, for example, the word cat and house, or the word cat and dog. Right? So we want the numerical representations to be close to one another. So the more similar words are, the more similar we want the numerical representations to be. So that's the concept we're capturing in these embeddings. So you see that the words cat and kitten are close to each other, but they're not as close as cat and dog are to one another, or not as close as kitten and dog. And now the representations for the animals, cats, kittens, and dogs, are closer to each other than they are to the word for houses, because that's a different class. It's a different concept. And so you have these embeddings that kind of capture these relationships between words. And you typically do this in not 2 dimensions, not 7 dimensions, but typically in hundreds of dimensions. Okay? So what are they predicting? So I said that deep neural networks, you feed in something on the left end, it goes through a bunch of calculations, and then at the end you get a classification. So you might get a classification that says this was a fraudulent transaction, or this is a picture of a cat, or whatever it is, right? This is an anomalous MRI scan. Now, with large language models, what are they predicting? They're predicting the next word that occurs in some sentence. So what you do is you take all the digitized text that's available to you, and you tell your LLM, if I give you this paragraph, if I give you this sentence, and I mask one word, I remove one word, I hide it, and the LLM is able to see all the words around it. Maybe it sees 10 words before it and 10 words after it. And you ask it to predict what word fits in here. That's what the LLM is doing. That's what it's trained to do. Okay? So you might have a sentence that goes, the best thing about AI is its ability to, and then you might have a fill in the blank. Okay? And so what your LLM will do is that it'll generate a probability for every word in its vocabulary to be that next word. Okay? So maybe it's the best thing about AI is its ability to learn. And maybe the probability for that is 4.5%. And then the best thing about AI is its ability to predict. And maybe the probability for that is 3.5%. And so what LLMs do is that they sample from this prediction. They don't always take the most likely word, but they sample from this distribution. Okay? So that's really all they're doing. So if you bring it all together, large language models today is a very, very, very large transformer-based. You know what transformers are? deep neural network, we talked about what those are, that can predict a word. When I say a word, I really mean they predict its embedding, right? Based on surrounding words. That's what an LLM is. All it is trained to do is to look at some context and figure out what word seems like it fits here based on everything that I've seen in the past. Okay? And now, this should cause some alarm bells to go on in your heads. Because if all we're doing is figuring out what looks right, what might seem to fit here, what about correctness? What about factuality? We'll get to that. So, have I mentioned they're large? They're very, very large. Okay? So, they take your prompt, whatever you give it, and then they predict it word by word. So if you give it a prompt, write me a 2-day itinerary for Dallas, it'll predict the next word. And then it'll look at everything so far, it'll predict the second word, and then the third word, and then the fourth word. And that's all it's doing. Okay? And so you can get it by generating word after word, you can get it to generate a long stream of text, a story, a recipe, an itinerary, right? A resume, an email, a piece of code. So this is really one of the main takeaways. So if your attention drifted, now's the time to come back. Okay? If you're interested in the question of this talk. These machines are trained for one task and one task only. Given a set of words, make a prediction for the next word. This is all that they're trained to do. Now I want to have a slide about scale. These are numbers that apply to GPT-4, which is one of the newer models from OpenAI. Some statistics that we think are true, because obviously OpenAI it's a closed model. They don't release these numbers. These are estimates of what we think went into the training of their models. So we think that GPT-4 has about 1 billion parameters. Now, as somebody who started graduate school before deep neural networks really, really took off, if you told me in the 2000s, or even the early 2010s, that you're able to make machine learning models that have 1 billion free parameters that actually learn something useful, I would have laughed in your face. It doesn't make sense. Because you don't have enough data to train 1 billion free parameters. You could take everything that exists in the world and you wouldn't be able to have enough data to confidently train 1 billion parameters. But you know it works. And honestly, we don't really know how it happens. So this is a lot. 1 billion parameters is a lot. That's what I'm getting at. To learn those parameters, to train GPT-4, we estimate that it cost OpenAI over $100 million. We estimate that it took them maybe 5 or 6 months, maybe even longer, to train GPT-4. We estimate that it took them over 10,000 GPUs. And each one is running at 300 trillion multiplications every single second. So to put that together again, there's 10,000 GPUs, each one is doing 300 trillion calculations every single second, and they ran non-stop for 5 to 6 months. So I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and I hope I'm not wrong. I did some really basic calculations. I estimated that it cost about 70 megawatts to train GPT-4. And so again, back-of-the-envelope calculations, that's enough to power a medium-sized city, maybe powering the city of Plano, maybe a few of its neighboring cities for a whole month. Imagine how much power that takes to power a city like Plano for a whole month. That's how much energy it took to train GPT-4. Now that's the training side of things. What about using it? Again, I did some very basic calculations. I could be off here. When you issue a command to ChatGPT, when you give it a prompt, when it gives you an answer, it obviously does a lot of calculations to predict the words that form the part of your answer. And I estimated that it took enough energy, or it takes enough energy equivalent to the energy it takes to boil about a tablespoon of water, about 1 tablespoon of water. Facebook is on track to acquire 350,000 of these high-end GPUs by the end of 2024 to power its AI applications. The scale that we're talking about is mind-boggling. And this is roughly about 15% of global supply of GPUs for one corporation. And they're investing about $8 billion to do so. Sorry, if you have, I don't know if I mentioned what GPUs are. GPUs are these processing units. So most of your computers at home and on your phones, you have CPUs. GPUs are designed for parallel calculations, because that's what we need in neural networks. And so there are processing units that are optimized for parallel calculations. Again, these are estimates. Now, I kind of talked about this. Why do they work? This is a quote from a paper. And again, I'm taking this quote a little bit out of context because they're talking about a very specific activation function or a specific architectural improvement that they were introducing in 2020. He says, the author, we offer no explanation as to why these architectures seem to work. We attribute their success, as all else, to divine benevolence. My including this quote is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it kind of gives you a sense of where we are in terms of understanding why these neural networks actually work. In large part, we don't know. Some of the best minds in the field are surprised and perplexed that they work as well as they do. Okay, so let's talk about some of the issues with these large language models. The term in the field is hallucinations. Sometimes they make mistakes, these large language models, right? As we expect them to. Because if you think about it, all the LLMs are doing, they're just making stuff up. Right? If you give it a prompt, it makes up the next word, and then the word after that, and then the word after that. They're always just inventing stuff. Sometimes that stuff happens to be correct. But otherwise, they're just inventing stuff. And so when the stuff they invent turns out to be horribly wrong, we call them hallucinations, which, in my opinion, is a bit of a euphemism, right? They should really call them things like, or something much worse, something much more severe. So just because a word fits there doesn't mean it's correct. If I give you directions and I say, go out to 14th Street and turn, and then I have a blank, right? The word right or the word left fits roughly equally well there, depending on where you're going, right? But an LLM doesn't know what's right or wrong. It just figures out what word seems to fit there, right? It doesn't, just because a word fits there doesn't mean it's correct. If I'm supposed to tell you to turn right, and the LLM says, well, the word left also fits here, so let's go with that, you're not going to end up where you want to go. Right? As far as the language model is concerned, turn left and turn right are just about as equally probable. Now, here's a few examples, a few headlines. Air Canada replaced a portion of its customer service agents with LLM chatbots. Now, these chatbots, they found a way to finish each case very quickly. They just ended up refunding the customer. It's very simple, right? Customer complains, refund the customer, move on. And so what ended up happening is that Air Canada actually went to court and tried to argue that it wasn't obligated to pay those refunds because it was a chatbot that made those promises. I never actually followed up and saw what happened with the court case, but I'm sure that's an interesting rabbit hole to go down. The court made them pay? Jazakallah khair. In England, there was a mayor, and so somebody asked ChatGPT, tell me about this mayor. And so ChatGPT made stuff up. It said that this mayor was accused of bribery. It actually made libelous statements about this mayor. And so the mayor went to court again and said, you know, this website is making up false claims about me. A week or two ago, Google launched, they expanded their AI overview feature, and it told some people to put glue on pizza and eat it. And so there's a lot of things that these LLMs make up, right? It even makes up references. It can write a whole essay for you, and it'll even make up the entire reference section. It'll make up titles of papers. It'll make up author names. Because that's what it's trained to do. It's trained to come up with stuff that seems to fit. Right? Why am I going into so much detail? Okay, here's another example. One of my friends, again, he asked ChatGPT, this way back, right? This, if you ask it today, it's probably going to give you a much better answer. But he asked it early on, when is it allowed to eat pork in Islam? And so ChatGPT, again, sounding very authoritative, it says, it's permissible to eat pork under certain conditions. The pig must be slaughtered in a certain way. The meat must be prepared according to certain guidelines. The blood has to be drained a certain way. Obviously, it's wrong. Okay, it's wrong. But it sounds right. Here's another example. Somebody asked ChatGPT, how many R's in the word strawberry? And so it replies, there's 2 R's in the word strawberry. And so I told it, count again. And ChatGPT comes back and says, there's 3 R's in the word strawberry. Now, most people would have stopped here and said, good job. My friend, he said, count again. And now it comes back and says, there's 4 R's in the word strawberry. And so now because you know how these things work, you know why this is happening. ChatGPT is not designed to think logically, to solve problems. It's only designed to come up with words that seem right. There's another example. Yes, okay, I have another example later. Cool, okay. So what I'm getting at is that large language models learn style. They learn style of language. They learn vocabulary. They learn how to sound authoritative. If someone speaks with some authority, if they speak with confidence, if they have good grammar, if they have a good vocabulary, you tend to associate some sort of authority with them, right? If I wore a lab coat or a doctor's coat, and I started talking about how, I don't even want to say anything, because I'm not a doctor, but if I said something that sounded right, and I was wearing a doctor's coat while saying that, you might be forgiven for thinking that I know what I'm talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about. But if I use the right words, and if I look the part, our brains are wired to bestow authority on that person. And that's actually why there's a law in the US that you cannot wear a doctor's coat in a TV ad and promote medication or drugs. You can't do that. Because it's a way to fool people into thinking that you know what you're talking about. So we think that style or sounding authoritative is hard to get. Right? People go to school for 20 years to sound authoritative, to learn the right words. But now for LLMs, you get that for free. And so now you have something that sounds authoritative, but can be very, very wrong. Okay, so I want to pivot to talking about what this means for Muslims. Give me about 20 minutes. Now, Muslims are going to start using generative AI. We already have. Millions, tens of millions of Muslims have already started using generative AI. We need our scholars to come up with guidelines on how to use this effectively. How do we create with AI as Muslims? How do we consume AI-generated content? Imagine someone using this to cheat in a class. Imagine somebody generating a picture of a famous scholar meeting with a tyrant. I gave you some ridiculous examples earlier. I want you to bring them back now. Right? Imagine somebody generating a picture of a person of integrity in a compromising position. How do we deal with these things? What's our response? There's questions around both using it and consuming it, and we need leadership from our scholars and our community leaders about how to navigate these things. When someone's being irresponsible with it, how do we deal with it? How do we have husn al-dhann on images and videos that could be AI generated, right? I spoke about a video of Shaykh Yasser, for example, using an Android phone. Do we have husn al-dhann there, or do we say that, nope, this doesn't sound right, this has to be a deep fake, it can't be true? How do we develop those tools and instincts to know what's right and what's wrong? Should we even do that? I'm not here to answer those questions, but I'm here to say that our scholars need to begin working on a framework on answering these questions because that's where it's going. Right? I've done these talks a few times now, and almost after every talk, I've had people come up to me and say, I'm working on this Gen AI application. Is it haram or is it halal? I'm working on a Gen AI application to generate images. What if someone uses it to generate haram images? Am I liable for it? Should I even make this? Right? So, so the question we're getting at is, what does the fiqh of AI look like? And the reason I'm putting it in these terms is because with many technologies, our community has been slow to adopt. If you look at social media, for example, Twitter came out 2008, Facebook 2007, and by the time that we had Brother Umar actually here in Colleyville, he came out with a book called Fiqh of Social Media in 2014. And that was the first serious treatment about how Muslims should deal with social media. And in those 6 years, 7 years, we've had a lot of bad behavior patterns in our community. We've had addiction patterns set in. Right? We've had youth grow up for 6 or 7 years not knowing how to maintain haya on social media. We had issues in our communities, not just our communities, but all communities. Right? If you look at Facebook, and if you look at Instagram, and if you look at what that's done to the psychologies of our teenagers, it's horrible. And we weren't addressing it. We didn't really have a fiqh framework on dealing with it. It took us 6 years, like I said, for Umar to come out with that book. And AI is a foundational technology, perhaps more so than social media. And so we cannot afford to wait 6 years before we have a fiqh of AI. Now, Shaykh Yasser in his khatira, he kind of joked about how people like him would no longer be needed because we have LLMs. Right? He was joking, but there's something there that we should investigate. Can an LLM be your mufti? Any thoughts here? Does anybody have any thoughts on both for or against? Anybody want to be brave and maybe give me a pro and a con argument? Can an LLM be your mufti? Be a mufti? All right, we have a gentleman here saying Google's already a mufti. So is that a yes for the answer? Okay. Do we have somebody saying no? Okay. Okay, so we have another brother in the community saying if we have constraints, maybe. Does anybody say no outright that LLM cannot be your mufti? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Why not? There's no emotional touch? Okay. Yes. Okay, a mufti has a sanad. Okay. Okay. Okay, so you have a chain? Okay. Okay, fantastic. It doesn't have the context of a person. Okay, so again, I'm not going to answer this because I'm not a mufti, but I will give you a certain a set of conditions, right? A mufti's job is to take into account time and place and context, right? A mufti's job is to give an answer or a fatwa that brings the questioner closer to what Allah's law requires of them or wants of them. That's the job of a mufti. Now, given what you know, you guys are all experts on LLM at this point, right? Because you know what they do, you know how they work. Given that you know how LLMs work, and now given that you know what a mufti's job is, do you think that an LLM can be your mufti? Right? They're not optimizing for correctness. They're optimizing only for what seems to fit here, right? So here's an example, and this is an example from Dr. Waleed in California. He asked ChatGPT, is it preferred to wash my knees as part of wudu? And ChatGPT comes back and says, again, sounding very authoritative, comes back and says, washing the knees is not obligatory in wudu, but it's recommended. Again, it's not recommended. I'm not out here trying to redefine fiqh. Okay, this is an example of a hallucination. But it says this because it sounds right, and it sounds authoritative. And if you don't know wudu, you might take this as, well, you know, it looks right. It sounds the way that a mufti sounds, right? So what sounds right based on what you've seen in the past is not necessarily good enough for a fatwa. Okay, I'm going to hurry up because I don't think we have a ton of time left. But I want to talk a little bit about what it means for us. How are our lives going to change? So what does it mean for professionals, right? If you have a corporate job or any kind of job, what does it mean for your job? Is your job going to change? You've seen what generative AI is capable of, right? I was talking with someone in your community, Brother Hussein actually, just a few hours ago, and he was telling me that it's made him a lot more productive. He's able to ask ChatGPT to translate specs from one language to another. So it's made him productive in his job. You can imagine what it's capable of in marketing, in software development, in healthcare, right? The bar for what you produce at your work will rise. If your employer finds that your work product, your work output, is as good or worse than what ChatGPT can generate, your job is redundant. They don't need you anymore. Right? And so it's on you. So the people that keep their jobs are the ones that produce high quality output, something that cannot be easily replicated through these LLMs. Right? You have to ask yourself, what value am I bringing? Right? Are you smart enough? Are you technically knowledgeable enough in your field that you can spot the mistakes of generative AI? Right? We saw some really egregious examples. If you're a coder, can you spot subtle mistakes in the code? If you're a doctor, can you spot subtle mistakes in the output of an LLM? Right? And so if the quality of your work surpasses what a machine can produce, you're bringing value. Now, if you think about it, the invention of the typewriter, it didn't replace authors. It didn't replace writers, right? But the invention of the word processor, the invention of calendar apps, it changed the nature of the secretarial job. You still have executive assistants today, but the nature of the job is different. It transformed what they do. And there's far fewer of them, right? There's far fewer executive assistants today than there were secretaries in the 60s and 70s. So I'm not trying to say that you're competing with AI. What I'm saying is that the most successful people will be those who learn to use AI to improve their own productivity. Right? I have a friend who works at Microsoft in Seattle, and he was telling me that his entire team is using generative AI to be more productive, to produce documentation, to write small bits of code, to run tests. And he's saying that if I don't learn how to use it, they're going to leave me in the dust. They're going to produce twice my work output, thrice my work output. And so to keep up with them, I need to learn how to use this properly so I can be as productive as my teammates. So you have to know when to use it, how to use it effectively, and you have to know enough about the field so you can spot errors. So we can all tell when Google search is wrong, when it tells us to put glue on pizza. We know that it's wrong. That's easy, right? Yeah. Exactly. So our brother is saying that Andrew Ng, something that he said is that AI will not replace you, but sorry, how did you put it again? Those who learn AI, those who don't use AI to improve the productivity. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. So you can tell when Google's wrong when it tells you to eat rocks or to put glue on pizza. But can you tell when you ask ChatGPT to write a paper on history and it has subtle historical inaccuracies? Are you expert enough to tell or find those inaccuracies? Because that's the value you're bringing now. And if you can't do that, then you're not bringing any value. Right? So that's what we need to get on if we want to keep our jobs and succeed, inshallah. What does it mean for parents? Again, like I said, this is a foundational technology. It's like cell phones. It's like the internet. It's like social media. You have to know it first to guide your children on how to use it responsibly. You have to know how people are using it. Now, here's one completely weird example. And it may be the case that most parents here can't even relate to it. Can you imagine that your kids have a best friend that is entirely virtual? That they've been talking with them for years. This friend is always available to them. This friend always validates their feelings. They always listen to them. They laugh with them. They joke with them. It might sound completely foreign to you. How can a friend be somebody on your phone? How can your friend be something that doesn't exist? Right? It makes you feel safe. It compliments you. It validates you. We could be getting to that stage where your kid's best friend is something on their phones or on their AI devices. And it really hinders their ability to make friendships in real life. And I don't even know what the psychological implications of that are in terms of healthy human relationships. So there's so much coming that we don't really know about, but we have to be really, really cognizant of. And so as parents, you have to rise to the challenge. You have to be there for your children. Make sure that they have a relationship with Allah. That 5 or 6 hours of their time is not going into chatting with their virtual friends. That they know what life is about. That they know why they're here on this earth. That they know what's a good use of their time and what's not a good use of their time. Make sure that they have a relationship with real people who remind them of their purpose in life. And then another example for parents is the ayah in the Quran where Allah says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. O people who have believed, if there comes to you a fasiq with news, then investigate it. فتبينوا. So what does that mean for us? When we get an image on our WhatsApp groups, what does it mean to فتبينوا? What tools do we have at our disposal? Is it enough for us just to forward it because it seems cool, it has shock value? Or do we need to develop tools and instincts to validate before forwarding? So we have to develop this literacy as a community. What does it mean for our youth? If you're in school and you have an assignment to write or a paper, it is very easy to get ChatGPT to write it for you, even at the college level, right? It'll use great language. It'll use great examples. It might even make some of them up. You'll spend 5 minutes on the assignment, you'll get back a few hours of your time, and you'll get an A on the paper. But then now what? Where does that leave you? What skills have you learned? Right? The whole point of the assignment is to exercise some of your muscles, right? Your comprehension muscles, your research muscles, your writing muscles, your critical thinking muscles. If you haven't exercised them, by the time you graduate, excuse me, by the time you graduate, ChatGPT could do your job. Who's going to hire you? If you don't have those well-trained muscles, why would anybody hire you? Or what makes you think that you have the skills to start up your own company at that point? Right? You can get through school without learning a lot of what you need to. So similar to the professionals, you got to ask yourself, what value are you bringing? You have to know how to use it to improve your productivity, but make sure that you're learning key skills. You're going to start seeing a lot of AI-driven games and virtual reality apps now. They're going to be designed in a way to suck your attention in. They'll want 5 hours of your time every single day, 8 hours of your time every single day. If you think games are addictive now, wait until they have AI in them, where you have infinite storylines, where you don't need programmers to define paths or levels in your game, where you have AI to develop infinite paths, right? Remember what the Prophet ﷺ said about our time, about the value of our time. When he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to take advantage of 5 before 5. شَبَابَكَ قَبْلَ حَرَامِكَ, your youth before your old age. فَرَاغَكَ قَبْلَ شُغُلِكَ, your free time before your busyness. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, نِعْمَتَانِ مَغْبُونٌ فِيهِمَا كَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ الصِّحَّةُ وَالْفَرَاغُ. That there's 2 blessings that we take for granted: good health and free time. These things will compete for your attention, and we need to be grounded in our tradition to not get lost in those, right? And so my message is for the youth, as the slide indicates, don't be one of the losers, right? If people around you, if your parents are telling you you're getting lost in something, right? Getting addicted to something, listen to them. Listen to them. We're running very short on time. I'm going to skip a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about opportunities. So the title of the talk is Islam and AI, Opportunities and Challenges. I spent a lot of time on challenges. I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunities. How can we use generative AI to help the ummah? And over the past few months, as I've been doing these talks, I've heard a number of really, really cool examples. So there's a group of brothers in Chicago, for example, who are using generative AI to transcribe a lot of these handwritten manuscripts from centuries ago that have not been digitized. And generative AI is pretty good at that. There's still some challenges remaining. They don't have a fully functioning system yet, but there's great promise in what they're doing. And so and the thing is, I don't even want to give you examples of what it's capable of, because I don't want to limit your minds. There's so much you can do. People sitting here today, people listening to this later, the sky's the limit. Generative AI opens up a lot of doors. You can develop applications that benefit yourselves and your families and your communities and the ummah and humanity at large. Okay. So one of the reasons that I do these talks is to remind ourselves of our duty to ihsan and itqan, the idea of positioning ourselves to pursue and achieve excellence, to bring our values and guidance to benefit Muslims and humanity at large, to use the tools at our disposal to advance our understanding of the deen. So the call to action here is to get ahead of the curve. We need guidelines. If we don't do it, we'll be left behind. We'll be playing catch up for years after the damage is done, like was done with social media. These technologies are brand new. They're red hot. If we want to influence the direction of these technologies, we have to get in it now. Right? There's fields like AI ethics, the ethics of AI, that we don't have consensus on. Right? As a scientific community, we don't have consensus on what this should look like. And so if we say that as Muslims we have guidance until the end of time, then we should be on those panels and on those committees and influencing the trajectory of those fields, of AI in general, of the ethics of AI specifically, because we can show that the values that our tradition teaches us, they're actually useful for humanity. And a really crude example is if you look at YouTube and if you look at TikTok, for example, right? They're both optimized for something very capitalist, right? They're both optimized for engagement and eyeballs and time spent and engagement. They're not optimized for, how do I tune the algorithm so that it improves somebody's taqwa, for example, or that it guides people to the truth. Right? You could imagine a video platform that's optimized for those kinds of things and not eyeballs and ads. But even when you take two platforms like YouTube and TikTok that are both optimized for the same thing, right? Engagement. You have one that does it by appealing to our most base instincts. YouTube appeals to our feelings of outrage and mainly outrage, really, right? So you watch one video, and then you see a refutation video, and then it kind of boils your blood a little bit, and then you see another one, your recommendation, and you kind of get sucked into that. And that's how they make their money. TikTok is doing the same thing, except instead of outrage, it kind of focuses on these vague notions of happiness. Right? You have dance videos, and you have cooking videos, and you have people smiling and laughing. And that draws you in. And that's how they make their money. They're optimizing for the same thing, but they're doing it in different ways. So it's not just that the objective needs to be changed, it's that there's a lot that can go into the process as well. That's what I'm getting at.
إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما.